All right, to start off the lecture, we're gonna talk about the resolutions and like some definitions of some words. So the resolution is resolved. The United Kingdom should rejoin the EU. The process of this would be like every single state approves of the UK rejoining the EU. Because the way it works in the European Parliament is that every state has to ratify something for it to be considered like legal. So every state would have to approve of the UK to rejoin the EU. The second part of it is it would be without opt-outs. So, for example, they'd have to adopt EU policies and are forced to follow them, like adopting the euro or certain trade or AI regulations, etc. Um, the actors of the topic are the UK and EU. So, like those are like the common terms in the resolution that'll be very important in a few later slides. Some background information is the EU was the economic or the European Economic Commission, and it was like institutions that included the Council, Parliament, Commission. It was a single market, and there means there was a free movement of goods, services, capital, and people, which means like that like people like could go like from place to place without like any new passports because like it was a single place. So there was like no import or export taxes, and it was like a free market basically. Some policies required like unanimous decisions like defense, budget, etc. The UK in like when it was in the EU was a constitutional or it still is, but a constitutional monarchy and it was a parliamentary democracy. It's a major like global power as it's part of the United Nations Security Council and is a permanent five member. It's also one of the G20 countries and it's also part of NATO. It also promotes like the global Britain vision, which is like what Britain it envisions Britain to be in the future. Um, there was then Brexit, which is what most of y'all, I'm assuming, know. It's when the UK separated from the EU. This was in 2016 when like there was like a referendum of a 52 to 48 vote because of things like immigration, sovereignty, economic concerns. The UK thought the EU was at fault. So as a result, they left in January of 2020, and trade barriers began like coming up as of January 2021 under the TCA, under like the UK. Current UK and EU ties are pretty good. Starmer seeks like a reset between them, and there's cooperation growing in things like defense, trade, and fisheries. The UK is not rejoining the single market stuff of the EU though, and Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, follows much of EU policy. Public opinion shows that 57% favor rejoining the EU, but EU demands return without opting out. Which means like they have to follow every single EU policy. The current party of the UK is the Labour Party. It's a center-left social democratic party, and is currently governed under the leader Starmer, which you'll probably see a lot on the topic. Its core priorities are rebuilding ties with the EU, strengthening the NHS and public services, and tackling like living costs, and investing in green energy. It positions itself as a pragmatic pro-worker and pro-European compared to the conservatives, which are like focused on like the rich. But these are like the common people, is what you could think of it as. It's polling strongly and it's set to shape the UK-EU relations in coming years because Starmer obviously is the one who's president. There are two like recent events that would be pretty key to the topic. The first is the EU-UK reset deal, which I talked about on a previous slide. Basically, in May of 2025 at Lancaster House Summit, the UK and EU agreed to start a new strategic partnership covering like security, defense, trade, energy, fisheries, and youth mobility. So like they increase security, agriculture and trade, fisheries, like energy, carbon border, and develop future frameworks. This might make it harder to find unique AFs and negs with the deal because it'll be like uninherent or non-unique because a lot of the things the app could argue would happen as a result of increased cooperation are happening now in the status quo, which might make it a little harder to find good arguments, but that just means your evidence will need to be better. Another thing is like Trump right now, obviously, I'm assuming most of y'all know, he's threatened tariffs or not even threatened, just put tariffs on the EU unless they increase US imports. And the July 2025 deal responded to a 15% increase on tariffs on EU exports in exchange for 750 billion in energy purchases and 600 billion in US private investment. Relations are kind of cooked. And the EU wants to lock in independently since they don't know Trump will support them because he's been like taking away stuff away from them. But those are like the most recent deals and everything you need to know about the background of the topic.
Okay, so now we're going to go over some common affirmative arguments on the topic. The first and most common argument is about the economy. You'll see this in a lot of your lay rounds, but also a good version of this can be very good in your more technical rounds. The first piece of uniqueness is just that there's generally economic decline. Some arguments will be specific to the UK, where some will be specific to the EU, and some will just be about both. Common things they'll highlight, as Sumith explained, is like Trump tariffs. If the arguments were specific about the UK, they might talk about how their manufacturing sector has declined. But it'll cite a lot of things like this. The link will usually be one of two things. First is that they join the single market, which, like Sumit explained, it lessens trade barriers. There's more movement of people, which provides things such as labor. There's more goods transferring through, which causes more trade, etc., which would all increase their economy. The second is just that there would be more direct investment. The UK will start spending. There would be more foreign direct investment from the UK going to the EU and the UK going to the UK. The internal link is that absent this increase in the economy, there might be a recession, or just generally people would fall into poverty, and that causes death. Like I said before, this is probably a good argument, both on the lay and on the tech. It's probably the most common argument on the topic, so you'll be seeing a lot of it. Next is the cohesion argument. Cohesion is just another word for like working together, and like kind of having agreement on their policies. So the first thing is that there's disagreement now. And we'll talk about this more later, but Trump is a big factor in these cohesion arguments. And there's a cohesion argument on the neg too that also has to deal, the unions also has to deal with Trump, but we'll talk about that later. But right now it's basically saying that Trump has caused people to take sides. For example, if you look to like the UK, has stronger relations with the US and the EU does. So they've kind of been more US leaning, whereas a lot of other EU countries um are more like antagonistic. So it's kind of forced countries to take sides. The other thing is just generally like politics. With the rise of populist leaders within the EU, there's a lot of internal divisions that prevent countries from making effective agreements and passing good policies. The link is that the UK joining would cause more leadership. They're obviously a big country, have a big global role, and so countries would want to listen to them and think that they have a big influence. And they would also be more confident in the EU to be able to pass policies. And there's also, like someone explained, a poll that was taken, and it showed that a lot of big countries, such as like France, Germany, and I think Spain, they all support it. But again, that is without opt-outs. The internal link to this argument is just that it's key to credibility. Obviously, the EU, no one's going to want to listen to the EU if they all disagree and they can't pass policies. But if they did agree, they would have more of a global influence, especially on countries as, like on the US and China. There's a thing called like the Brussels effect, which is just the idea that the EU is like a middle power, amidst like countries like the US, China, and Russia all fighting each other. The EU has an opportunity to sort of promote good regulations and policies. There's a lot of options for your impacts. You can use climate change arguments, deterrence like to the military, AI arguments, which we'll go into more later, and just general economy arguments. This is good to go for as it solved their arguments. You can be like an impact filter that says that like good EU leadership solves XYZ. Then you can go for that, it solves their arguments, super useful. Second argument is kind of expanding on that, but more specifically is the deterrence argument. The uniqueness will usually have two pieces. The first is that Russian aggression is increasing. This can be specific to Ukraine, but some people like to read arguments about like they're going to invade the Baltics or just in general they're going to attack more NATO countries. The second part to this is that right now Europe is too reliant on the US amidst tariffs and stuff. And Trump has like said rhetoric that makes it seem that he's going to like pull out of Europe and focus more on Asia. And so lots of pieces of evidence say that the EU is going to need to stand up. The link for this argument says that one, it would increase defense spending. The UK is a big global power and it has a strong military, and joining the EU would not only cause like joint procurement where they help fund things, but it would also cause leadership. And like through the cohesion argument, it would encourage other countries to also invest in the military. And then that would solve whatever your uniqueness highlights, whether it be Ukraine, a future Russia war. I don't know why I didn't finish typing. The Baltics invasion, etc. Important is that this evidence needs to spike the current deal because the reset deal did cause an increase in defense spending. So evidence needs to say that either that's not enough or maybe they're not going to actually follow through with that, something like that. Next argument is just a kind of general category of argument. These are called alignment arguments. So the basic idea is that right now the EU and the UK have different policies, which means that like investors and global countries are uncertain about what policies are good, so they just don't follow either, or they choose to follow certain ones, which like makes them not as credible. But the link is that affirming means that the UK would have to follow EU regulations, as there would most likely not be opt-outs, which means that they align their policies. So we have three different scenarios here, that people have read. The first is an aviation argument. I get this one. Basically, what it just says is that SAFs, which are sustainable aviation fuels, um are low in production now, and countries often rely on the US, which the evidence says those fuels aren't as good. They're worse for the environment and cut less emissions. The link says that the UK, if they were to align their policies with the EU, it would cause more confidence in investors, so they would spend more money and invest in production. There'd be more development of like supply chains and more production. Also, the UK could trade their fuels with the EU, etc., which would also give them a global influence and they would be seen as credible. The impact for this argument is that aviation emissions cause climate change. There's a card that says that like they're super high in the atmosphere, so they worsen climate change. The next, more common argument is the AI argument. This says that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is coming now, and it'll be unregulated and misaligned because countries like US and China are in a tech race, and so they're focusing on just innovating AI as fast as possible without ensuring that it's safe. The link for this argument is that the AF would cause the AI to be more regulated. The EU passed something called the AI Act, but the main issue with it is that the EU has not spent a lot of money investing in their AI. So they have good AI regulations. They're not seen as like a credible actor because they don't have innovated AI. But the UK has the reverse, so they have innovation and investment. So when combining the two, you get strong regulations along with strong innovation, which would then cause global people to adopt it. The impact is that AGI cause extinction. Misaligned AI would people might use it in their militaries, which would cause miscalculation. Also, it could just be like evil and it want to kill humanity. That's what S risks are. That causes like infinite suffering, that type of stuff. I see as the climate change argument probably the most common of the three. Right now, it just said the EU's climate policies are weaker than the UK. They lack investment and credibility, similar to the other two arguments. But the app would cause more cooperation on climate technology, increasing the EU's leadership abroad, and that would decrease emissions. You should probably read some evidence that says the EU is key. Either that could be that the EU has like alone has a high emissions profile, or just that they would spur like global follow-on. Some notes is that the aviation impact is not very good. This is kind of a more niche argument, which is why I originally cut it, but more people might catch on and then they might realize that the impact is like kind of not that good. Because most likely other things definitely cause climate change. But the climate change argument on its own, without like the aviation part, could be a very persuasive argument on the lay, but it's also a good strong tech argument. The next argument is the politics af. This is similar to the econ argument, except it has some other nuances. First, it's just general econ evidence. It says the econ decline now, but it says that this makes the Labour Party unpopular. So this is Starmer's party, the current people who are currently running. And then the next part of the uniqueness says that they're most likely going to lose their next election. However, the app would increase the economy, which would on its own make them more popular. Obviously, people will have more confidence in the government if they're doing well. And then it also says that the app is generally popular. This is the YouGov poll that we talked about earlier, where it says like more than half of countries support it. The impact, first, it's just a general econ argument, so can read a recession impact, which we explained earlier. Or there's the UK populism impact, which just says that populist leaders get elected and that they focus on more internal issues, but they don't focus on global issues such as whatever it be, climate change, war, etc. And that they would reject institutions like the EU and multilateralism, that type of stuff. And that would you can also read arguments that UK populism causes broader EU populism, and then that's bad. Yeah, some notes for this argument is that it could be strategic to hide this politics argument inside of an econ contention, as there's lots of overlap. And this is also good to answer the neg politics argument, which we'll talk about later.
All right, so now we're gonna talk about the negative arguments or the reasons why the plan is bad. The first one, um, the first argument is the AI innovation argument. Basically, this argument says that right now Britain is emerging as a global AI leader, but the UK rejoining the EU forces the UK to adopt what is known as the EU's AI Act, which deters investment because of excessive regulations. Because the EU likes to regulate things a lot, it wants its AI to be safe. It makes a lot of countries like excessively regulate their AI, but in turn that costs a lot of money. So investors would go and invest in someone else's cheaper AI, which in turn make the AI less profitable and like less like significant. Um, what is important about this argument is that a strong AI sector allows the UK to influence global AI norms. And then the impact is that bad AI norms cause extinction, but good ones solve it. Some notes about this argument is that like the uniqueness might be kind of false because China and the US are obviously leaders, but you can find some specific evidence. And make sure your impact evidence is very good because most of the time AI impacts are well warranted. Another thing to note is that I forgot to write on the PowerPoint is that the internal link could be kind of fake because like the UK is one country out of another 190 plus countries. So obviously it probably doesn't have that much of influence. But if your evidence says it does and it has some good reasons for it, then that should not be a reason to deter you from reading this argument because it has a lot of good potential. The next argument is the relations argument. Basically, this argument is that like Trump is positioned as strongmanning Europe or thinking he's like the big dog, threatening them with tariffs, etc., like as you've seen this year. Um, Basically, the link says that Trump doesn't like the EU gaining power, which is what he'd perceive when the UK rejoins the EU because like they're Britain strong, EU strong makes even stronger country. The internal link is that Trump threatens the EU and he has to follow through with his threats because otherwise they lose their legitimacy. Like, for example, if you tell someone, like, don't do this or I'm going to do something bad and then you don't do anything bad, like, they're just going to stop listening to you. So he eventually has to, go through with his threats towards the EU. And in turn, that would lead to nuclear miscalculation because he threatens them with their arsenal, decking relationships, not protecting them from their adversaries all the time. Some notes, is that ironically, Trump actually, like, never really follows through with his threats as seen in like the past in his first presidency. Um, so like that's a pretty good argument you can make if you have good evidence for it. Secondly, is that the link card has to be super strong. It has to say like this one instance makes Trump think that the EU will gain so much power that he can't control them, and then he has to do that. Because if it just says they gain power, like Trump doesn't like a lot of things and doesn't threaten them. So your evidence has to be super specific. The thing I like about this argument though is that it has good weighing off of it. So if you have good evidence and you can win it, this is a pretty solid argument. The next argument is the cohesion argument. Basically, is that cohesion is high now, and that Trump is forcing unity between the EU countries, like because he is threatening them. So it's like literally like Trump threatening equals EU cooperation because they have to cooperate, otherwise they're cooked. The link is that countries don't like rejoining the UK rejoining the EU, and that because of the UK gets opt-outs and other countries get influence from Brexit. This might be the opt-outs part might be a little shady because you could read definitions as to why they don't get opt-outs, or that's why it was a thing in the past. But like countries, like other countries got influence from Brexit is like kind of true. Um, which might like as a result decrease cohesion. Cohesion is key for things like credibility and to pass policies. And countries, just getting along in general and like wanting to do things together. For the impact, there's lots of options like climate change, deterrence, AI, economy. And you can also read like impact filters so you can turn their arguments. So you have got lots of options there. Some notes is that like it can be read as a turn against the cohesion half. Because like it's literally the opposite of the affirmative. And there's a lot of good turns case arguments like EU dysfunctional means the app doesn't matter because they can't pass anything or do anything. The next argument and last argument on the neg is like a politics argument. Basically, the uniqueness is like the Labour Party wins now, or Starmer, what I was talking about the background information. The link is that the app is unpopular and that Starmer breaks his promise by saying that like he like would keep it independent, and that it would only be co-op. As a result, this would cause populists to win and exploit his error by saying, "Look, Starmer doesn't go, he doesn't follow through with his promises. He doesn't do this," and in turn generate support, which causes them to win. And the impact is UK populism. They don't focus on global issues. They reject the EU, which in turn collapses like cooperation, decking support for Ukraine, a bunch of impacts you can read off populism. Notes are you can go for it as like circumvention. So like if they're populist, it takes away all the benefits of the affirmative because even if they're tied to the Britain, the populace would just not listen or not do anything. It has good turns case potential. Another thing though is that the time frame might be kind of slow because the election is in like 3 years. But if you can win that the 3 years is faster than whatever the apps thing is, this argument can be super strategic. I think it's the most true argument on the topic because that is definitely the biggest reason as to why like like a Brexit getting reversed would be bad because it's obviously unpopular.